My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
And the need to use diplomacy and build international consensus to resolve our problems whenever possible.
Our diplomats are working with a range of partners to strengthen human rights protections.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Hello, and welcome to Diplomatic Immunity. My name is Kelly McFarland, Director of Programs and Research at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Across our podcast miniseries on the Arab Spring, 10 years on, we have heard stories from 5 countries in the Arab world where people rose up to demand economic and political freedoms. From the seeds of revolution in late 2010 in Tunisia to a decade of civil war in Syria, the results have been far from uniform. Several countries, Yemen and Libya being notable examples, saw initial hopeful progress turn quickly into counter-revolution and the descent into civil war. However, recent progress in Libya, for example, and the success of the UN-backed Libyan Political Dialogue Forum highlights that the stories of the countries we have explored during this miniseries are far from static. As we learned from the conversations we had as part of this series, the last 10 years provide only a snapshot of a history with much deeper roots and whose legacies are still playing out today. To understand how some of the trends we have explored throughout this miniseries fit together, we spoke to Stephanie Williams. I'm here with our podcast producer, Alistair Somerville, who put together the miniseries. Alistair, tell us a bit about Stephanie Williams and her career over the last 10 years.
Yes, and if you haven't had a chance to listen to the country episodes so far, follow the links in the show notes to explore them further. Stephanie Williams was well placed to look at trends over the last decade throughout the region. She was a career Foreign Service officer who was serving as Chargé d'Affaires, the acting US ambassador in the Kingdom of Bahrain when revolution also broke out there in 2011. She then served the US in Jordan and Iraq before leading the US mission to Libya during 2018. She then made a very interesting move which gives her a unique vantage point on events. She went from the US government to the United Nations, where she represented the Secretary General, first as deputy head of the UN support mission in Libya, and then as its acting head. She set up the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum and led a widely praised inclusive process toward the formation of a new interim government earlier this year. We were also joined for the conversation with Stephanie Williams by Hammad Hammad, an ISD Rusk Fellow and Foreign Service officer, who worked at the US mission to Libya based in Tunis from 2015 to 2016. Hammad, before we get to the conversation, how did things look from the US side in Libya back in 2015 when you were working on the country compared to today?
There's definitely a sense of cautious optimism at the creation of the Government of National Accord in 2015, similar to the sense I get today from my Libyan friends with the creation of a new interim unity government. Much work remains, but I'm an optimistic person and hope the new interim government can lead to democratic elections by the end of the year and to further stabilization in Libya.
To get a sense of how the last decade began for Stephanie Williams, I began the conversation by asking for her perspective from Bahrain in 2011 when uprisings broke out there. We haven't covered Bahrain as a separate episode in our Arab Spring series, but like all the different uprisings and protest movements throughout the Arab Spring, it has its own story of revolution. And it'd be great to get a picture of what it was like from your perspective as the Chargé there during the beginning of the Arab Spring. When did you begin to realize that this was something bigger than the norm of the protest movements that we had seen around the region and in Bahrain? And then also, how do you evaluate, because this is going on at the same time as Tunis had ended, but Egypt is going on and other places at this time. How do you evaluate the initial U.S. response to what was going on in Bahrain and around the region?
Yes, I was in Bahrain on February 14th. That was the first day of what became known as the uprising in Bahrain. It was a fairly brief uprising, particularly in comparison with some of the other uprisings or revolutions in the region. Especially if you think of Libya. It had a short cycle in Bahrain, so it sort of started mid-February, and it was pretty much over kind of end of the first week of March. I thought that the administration's, response to what was happening in Bahrain, was quite appropriate, because what we saw in Bahrain initially was not a sectarian movement. Bahrain is, of course, a majority Shia population. But what we saw, the people who turned out, for instance, at the Pearl Roundabout, were from both Shia and there were Sunni groups represented as well. And the initial calls were for reform. So you didn't initially see, the calls for regime change that were resonating elsewhere, in the region. The protests, the demonstrations became more intense. Of course, the Ministry of Interior, the police began to also engage. The protesters, the demonstrators, entrenched themselves in the Pearl Roundabout, like we saw in Tahrir Square in Cairo. There were encampments. You had, medical tents. It really just, became a center of protest that did start to unnerve, I think, officials in the government. So I would say in the second week, end of the second week, it started to take more of, I would say, a sectarian nature, where I think, and on both sides. So some of the Sunni groups started to withdraw, and what you saw were sort of the hardliners on both sides, I would say. On the side of the protesters, the more hardline voices in the Shia community, as well as hardliners in the regime. Their positions started to solidify. And then it just sort of started to devolve into a downward spiral. From there, it became more violent. And at the end of the day, despite, I think, some efforts by more moderate figures in the government, in the ruling family, and here I think notably of the Crown Prince, Prince Salman bin Hammad, their voices got drowned out by some of the more hardline elements. And then by the time the protests had moved, or the demonstrators had moved into the financial district in Bahrain, that became very unsettling, particularly for Bahrain's neighbors. And so there was a decision taken quite quickly, I would say, by the Saudis and the Emiratis, that this kind of upheaval in Bahrain was simply not going to be tolerated in the Gulf region. They believed that there was a heavy, sort of Iranian hand behind this. And they moved quite quickly in. The Saudi, tanks came over the causeway early-ish March, and it was over. It's not so much, I think, what happened during the protests as what transpired afterwards that I think makes Bahrain perhaps a missed opportunity in that whole period of the Arab Spring. Had, I think, the protests been dealt with a little bit differently, had perhaps there been more opportunities for the moderates to have been heard, perhaps you could have seen the kind of political reform that was called for initially. So what happened during the crackdown was quite unsettling for Bahrain. It really tore the society apart. There were, a number of arrests, a number of cases of torture in prison. then the king did something that I think was actually quite important. And as we now, 10 years after, as we reflect back on the Arab Spring and what so many of the countries went through, he decided to call for an independent commission of inquiry into the events around the uprising. And he asked, he's the late now great Dr. Sharif Basyouni, an Egyptian American law professor who had spent many years working both with the United Nations and other organizations, quite a noted scholar and human rights activist, and specialist in the issues of sort of transitional justice. So Sharif came out to Bahrain with this commission of other independent experts, and he conducted an extraordinary, I think, sort of 3 or 4 months of an investigation, an inquiry into what had transpired. Something like 9,000 interviews were conducted. Look, it was the doors were opened for Dr. Sharif and the team. And then towards the end of November of that year, in full view of the Bahraini public, because this was all aired on television, Sharif delivered the findings of what was then known as the BICI, the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry. And it was really quite stunning because it was a rebuke of, in many ways, of the government's action. It dismissed this idea that this was all an Iranian conspiracy. It found that the government had committed abuses. It also criticized demonstrators, protesters, for instance, for targeting the South Asian laborers, the community who large South Asian community who have worked in Bahrain for many, many generations. And they sort of put forward this set of recommendations, many of which I think were implemented. And it was quite an extraordinary, experiment in the Middle East region that a government that had been through this would allow, such an inquiry to take place, and that its findings would be made public. I believe now that I think Bahrain has an opportunity again with the ascension of the Crown Prince to the premiership. He's now the Prime Minister of Bahrain following the death of his great uncle, the Crown Prince. Then, and I believe still is perhaps the most widely accepted, figure in the Shia community in Bahrain. So, I think that the U.S. response was quite appropriate. I think that there was a recognition that Bahrain wasn't, necessarily, it's not a copy paste deal with the Arab Spring. Every country had its own dynamics. Certainly the U.S. had important and still has important strategic interests in Bahrain. It's home to the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet.
You make a good point on the ascension of the Crown Prince to the premiership, and at some point to being king. As I recall, his uncle was sort of the hardliner of hardliners. So bringing the more moderate Crown Prince up into that position and not having that hardline element in the premiership, I think will make a big difference going forward. And you mentioned the Saudi and GCC Peninsular Shield intervention in 2011. And that kind of brings me to my next question. And you've served in Bahrain, Jordan, Iraq, on Libya stuff. And, all of those in one way, shape, or form have had to deal not only with their own internal issues and problems, but also the regional issues have tended to play themselves out in those countries as well. Can you kind of give us a sense of sort of how you've seen the regional animosities, the regional tensions play out in these posts that you've been at over the course of the last 10 years?
Well, and again, I mean, it has varied from country to country, and certainly things got, I think, just much more intense after the famous rift between the Emiratis, Saudis, and Bahrainis on one hand, and the Qataris on the other. And then when I served in Iraq, of course, the regional tension involved Iran and Turkey to an extent as well, and that there was a whole sectarian flavor to that. It's certainly an important factor. I felt it most obviously during my United Nations experience in Libya, where the regional dimension had a direct influence on the course of the conflict there. But even in Jordan, which is a moderate monarchy that is heavily dependent on assistance from the Gulf states, there are definitely very, very strong relationships there, and so it's a factor just about everywhere in the region, and certainly in most of the places that I've served.
Thank you. We'll turn to Libya now, building on that. What role did the U.S. have or try to play during your time as Chargé d'Affaires covering Libya, especially with the rise of Khalifa Haftar as a force at that time?
So I was the head of the Libya External Office, the Chargé d'Affaires for what was the U.S. Embassy to Libya, but based in Tunisia, from January 2018 to June 2018. Certainly our official policy at the time was to be fully supportive of the implementation of the Libyan political agreement and of the then UN political process and the SRSG, Ghassan Salama. And Ghassan had, the previous fall, had introduced an action plan that sought to amend the Libyan political agreement, which had encountered, resistance and rejection almost from the day that it was, signed in 2015 and through its, the attempts to implement it in 2016 and 2017. And specifically, Ghassan, his action plan called for amending the Libyan political agreement to reduce the presidency council from, nine members, which was just very unwieldy, down to 3, and to have a separate prime minister and a government with its own prerogatives, separate from the presidency council. He encountered a lot of resistance from the existing institutions. During this period, of course, Mr. Haftar was a factor. He became more and more of a sort of counterterrorism partner for important international powers. He was sort of collecting, these countries, and he was seen as a counterterrorism partner to an extent by the United States, at that time. We also, our official relationship in Libya was with the government of National Accord, who were also, very, very good counterterrorism partners. And in addition, there were good ties with the armed groups in Misrata, who had played the key role in ousting Daesh from Sirt in 2016. So, Mr. Haftar was already a figure on the scene by the time that I arrived. We were under no illusions at that time, we were under no illusions as to what his, ultimate project might be. But we felt that there was still a great opportunity for the UN process to achieve a peaceful outcome and unification of institutions, and so we were squarely, sort of behind the SRSG Ghassan Salama.
I actually remember attending this Herat summit where the Libyan political agreement was signed when I was in the Libya External Office, and where the Libyan Government of National Accord was formed, and there was such a feeling of hope at the time. I'm curious what the experience was like for you moving to from the US side to the UN. Can you tell us a little bit about how diplomacy is done differently on the UN side?
Well, immediately, of course. I mean, the day that I took up my duties in Libya was the day that I arrived on the ground in Libya. So the big difference being that the UN had started to move its operations, back into Libya. Of course, like the U.S., like many of the major countries and organizations, the UN had pulled out of Libya in the summer of 2014 because of the intense civil war that was rocking, particularly Tripoli at that time. And so, but the UN had started to sort of return in 2017, and we formally returned everyone. The duty station was changed back to Tripoli in January of 2019. But in mid-July 2018, I flew directly from Tunis into Libya. And that's the big difference, is being on the ground. As the US, as the head of the Libya External Office, I had traveled to Libya twice between January and June, once to Tripoli and once to Misrata. These were trips that could only be undertaken, with the lift provided by the U.S. military, and we could only, like, for instance, when I went to Tripoli, I couldn't leave the naval base, and when I went to Misrata, I couldn't leave the Misratan Air Academy. I had to have all of the meetings there, no overnights. You get back on the plane and you leave. So when I went to work for the UN, I was living, in Tripoli, and there's just no substitute for being on the ground. The other difference, I think, being that I was exposed to just, way more Libyans and a variety of Libyans. And early on in my tenure, we had the first attack on Tripoli that took place in late August, September of 2018. And that brought me face to face in dealing with the heads of the armed groups in Tripoli and those forces that were attacking Tripoli, because we directly led the ceasefire negotiations.
And how were you perceived differently by Libyans when you represented the United Nations as opposed to the United States?
That's a good question. So, Libyans have it's almost like a bittersweet relationship with the United States, because there was, the U.S. had the largest military base, at least in the Mediterranean, if not wider. Wheelus Air Force Base, which became Matiga Airport, in the 1960s, before Gaddafi took over. Of course, the 42 years of Gaddafi, had us on opposite sides. But many Libyans were educated in the United States, and so there's a great affection. And so I have to say, I was always very warmly greeted wherever I went. I had gotten to know many Libyans, of course, as in my job as the head of the Libya External Office. So it's not like I had a huge learning curve. Of course, I think many people thought it was, when you transition almost directly from, a government to the United Nations, and the fact that the United States, we do this a little bit differently, in that we don't really second officials to the United Nations. So I retired. I left the US government and I joined the United Nations. In many cases, other countries second officials. So there's a blurring of lines. And so I do think for a little while, Libyans thought that I was still working for the United States. But I made that clear, in every meeting, that I had been appointed by the Secretary General, that I had completely left my duties and retired from the US government.
And does seeing things from the UN side make you feel differently about how the United States conducts or could conduct its own diplomacy, especially in the Middle East?
So I know, look, and I think this is still the case in Libya. I think the United States should not underestimate its influence, and even with a modest investment in what I would term as the United States convening authority, its ability to bring people together can make a huge difference, particularly as I reflect on my 2.5 years and a full year of being the UN mediator. That I think, and I very much hope that that's what the new administration, the current administration, considers as it works on or formalizes its Libya policy is to not underestimate the degree to which people want to hear from the United States, and they look to the United States, and particularly in the context of Libya, where, with the exception of that brief period around Haftar's attack on Tripoli, where there were phone calls from the White House that I think sent a very unfortunate message. The United States is viewed as much more of a neutral actor in comparison to other countries who have had direct involvement in the conflict in Libya.
So one of the things that we have looked at during this Arab Spring mini-series we've been doing for the podcast has been about the importance of getting all of the voices to the table to try and reach some kind of lasting governance solution or process that works for citizens of the country. So I was wondering, as the UN special representative, how did you integrate different tracks and promote an inclusive process, including at both the local, national, and then international levels?
Okay, so the concept of building a more inclusive process was firmly embedded in Hassan's initial action plan, step number 2 in his action plan was to convene a national conference. And he had recognized that for, I think, all of the promise initially that we saw in Skhirat and Libyan political agreement, ultimately it was not seen as an inclusive process in Libya. And this became evident in that it was rejected by key constituencies. One of the constituencies that was not at the table in Skhirat were the members, of the former regime. And so Hassan had started, he sort of asked the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue to assist in the building of the national conference, and HD, which had a presence on the ground through the period where the United Nations was not on the ground, undertook and in fact, organized over 70 meetings, inside Libya and several outside of Libya with the diaspora all around the country, where they could move much more freely, and unencumbered than the United Nations, which, is a structured organization which has legitimate security concerns. And so HD conducted these meetings mostly, with the assistance of the elected municipal councils throughout the country, which brought together, Libyans who had not really sat down for some years, and they did this in the spring and summer of 2018, and they produced a report which was published in late 2018, which became the foundation of the national conference which we were organizing, which was then aborted by Mr. Haftar. But this idea of building a political process that went beyond the Skhirat institutions and really brought in constituencies who hadn't been represented. So, the former regime, but also, ethnic components, women, civil society, tribal leaders. And so that's what we sought to do initially in the political track that was built around Berlin. And the Berlin process itself is important to pause on that, because while the 2017, while the action plan was an inside out process, after Haftar's attack on Tripoli, and given the clear dysfunction that became evident first in the Security Council and more widely, in the international community, Hassan said, "Hey, we need to change our strategy here. We need, first an outside process that builds an international umbrella under which we can develop the Libyan tracks." And so, he said, "Look, let's have an international process where you retain the P5, the permanent members of the Security Council. You bring in the regional actors who are most directly intervening on the ground and the regional organizations. And you need an international sponsor, a country that is seen as neutral but yet influential." And the obvious candidate there was Germany. And so he went to Berlin, pitched it to Chancellor Merkel. She agreed. We started a process through the fall of 2019 as the conflict was raging that culminated in the Berlin conference, where Putin, Sisi, Erdogan, of course, the Chancellor, Macron, Conte, the then Italian Prime Minister, you had all of these. Boris Johnson went, Secretary Pompeo represented the United States. So, you had these world leaders gathering to agree to a 55-point communique that built the architecture for the Berlin process, which continues till today. That was formalized in the Security Council Resolution 2510. And then under that, we built the Libyan tracks: economic, political, military, and then there's an international humanitarian law, human rights, international working group. So one of the takeaways also, from Skhirat, and this, also, I think, takes into account the fact that the Libyan conflict is different in the sense that it's a conflict occurring in a rentier economy. So you cannot ignore the economic drivers of this conflict. Is ultimately a conflict over access or control of resources and authority. And so we had worked on the economic dimensions of the conflict. When I came into the United Nations, I built an economic policy unit under my office. We started dealing with the financial and economic sovereign institutions, the central bank, the National Oil Corporation, the Libyan Investment Authority. These are the big institutions that where there has been intense competition over their control. So we baked that into this process. There's a separate economic track, Libyan-led, or not. We facilitated it, but Libyans had the conversations inside the room. Economic track, political track, military track. We started all of those tracks in January 2020. The economic track was quite smooth because these were technocrats and they decided to leave politics at the door, and they actually made a lot of progress. We had two major physical, meetings, one in Tunis and one in Cairo. We had two sessions of the Joint Military Commission in Geneva, January and February 2020. It was tense. They would not agree to meet directly, no face-to-face talks. They were parallel talks because the conflict was still raging. The political track was the most troubled. We had people who boycotted the meeting, who didn't even come. We had some delegates who came and then left after a day or were withdrawn after a day. And we had bombs dropping on Tripoli throughout the meeting. So this was, this was quite difficult to do. Then Hassan left. He left the mission because of health reasons, and that coincided with the COVID pandemic. And then, the whole negotiation took on a very, I would say, a very different, not direction, but the style of negotiation had to be adjusted.
Just a quick question on that in terms of the impact of COVID on the negotiations and how that affected your approach. Was there anything that surprised you, maybe even positively, about convening people virtually rather than in person for all of those meetings?
So what we did, we had to move everything online with COVID. And we knew that we had to sort of rebuild the political track, because the formula used for Geneva, that first Geneva meeting, didn't quite work, because we couldn't work in enough of these other constituencies, such as women and the ethnic components. And so I can come back to the political track, but we did, for instance, on the military track, we sustained, a dialogue, meetings, again, parallel. They wouldn't meet even over the Zoom and with each other. We had separate, sort of parallel meetings with them throughout the spring and summer. We continued to meet with the economic track as well. So really what happened also during this period was that, and this, is a direct result of Mr. Haftar invited, many countries to assist him in his attack on Tripoli. This then led the Government of National Accord, the UN recognized government, to invite Turkey in to counter the Mr. Haftar and his friends. And what happened was that because of that, Turkish involvement, Mr. Haftar was pushed out of Western Libya. A stalemate ensued. There was essentially a cessation of hostilities that remains till today. It was formalized in the ceasefire that was signed under UN auspices in October. But with the sort of silencing of the guns in the center of Libya, the line between Sirte and Jafra, that enabled us to start a conversation again in these two tracks, in the military track and the political track. In the political track, I started really what was a track 2 process. Again, we went under the umbrella of HD. We used Geneva as a place to convene meetings. We sort of brought people together, different political forces on the opposite sides of the conflict. We held a series of meetings, and sort of by mid-September, there were a couple of developments. One was that enough political forces had come to the conclusion that they were ready to meet. They all agreed, though, that they didn't want Mr. Haftar at the table as a political force. They sort of wanted him back into his military box. So that occurred. Mr. Siraj, the Prime Minister and President of the Presidency Council of the GNA, decided that he wanted to leave. He had signed up, after Skhirat. It was supposed to be a 1-year, deal. It turned into 2 years, and pretty soon it was 5 years. And he was tired, ready to move on. And so that provided an opening to actually formally rejuvenate the political process, along with these understandings between, these major political constituencies. And then the military track came back into the forefront again. They asked, and here I must say, Egypt played a very helpful role, because the Egyptians convened a meeting in Gardaga towards the end of September that brought together some members of the 5+5 on both sides. That was a sort of warm-up to what became the formal meeting that took place in Geneva, third week of October, between the two sides of the Joint Military Commission. Then we went directly into face-to-face negotiations. They were ready to deal. They were ready to sign an agreement. They were ready to ask foreign forces to depart the country. And they were, one of their major asks of me was, you get the politicians together. We need a national unity government, and we need elections. And so they gave me the leverage that and enabled me to put pressure on the political actors who were, of course, at the end of the day, the most resistant to any change, because, the military institution will one way or another always remain. But, what do elections do? Elections sweep aside the current political class and bring in another political class. But we were able to take the results of the military dialogue and put pressure on the political class, which is what we did when we convened them in Tunis initially in the second week of November.
Well, thank you for sharing all of that. I think it's very interesting for our listeners to kind of hear how the constituent groups and the series of meetings can kind of lead to what will hopefully be a lasting agreement and elections later this year in Libya. And one final question that we've posed to some others we've talked to for this series: what's your hope for Libya and for the Arab world and the countries that you've served in going forward? There's been a lot of discussion and in this 10th anniversary year about the status quo in the Arab world, lasting issues that haven't been resolved in the last 10 years. And this is clearly going to be a long process. What's your hope for Libya and other countries that you've served in going forward?
I think Libyans are like many people around the world, and here I reflect on, I think President Biden has just remarked on this. We're in a sort of a competition now, a race globally between the forces of democracy and autocracy. Libyans clearly, and all of the national polling confirms this, Libyans want democracy. They want to be able to choose their leaders. They want elections. And I would just say throughout this entire period, even while Tripoli was under attack, municipal elections were being held all over Western Libya and in Southern Libya. And candidates were running and people were going to the polls. I mean, was it in the numbers or the percentages that were ideal? No, but it shows that green shoots of democracy are there. I think that Libya has great potential to, conduct national elections on time, December 24th of this year. I think that, Libyans themselves have decided it's time to put aside, the divisions, the bitterness, but not to forget the importance of transitional justice and accountability as they move forward with this broader national reconciliation process. But what I witnessed in my year, basically as the international mediator, and what I saw, firsthand in the meetings of both the military meetings, where there was an extraordinary degree of camaraderie and patriotism, but also in the political meetings, where you saw really figures who had been bitterly opposed to each other, coming together. So there's a huge opportunity in Libya now. Libya doesn't have to fit anyone else's paradigm. They can have their own paradigm. It's a country with a small population, 7 million, extraordinary, potential in terms of its oil reserves. Of course, that makes it also a rich target, but there is, I think, the return of a uniquely Libyan identity. And so now it's just up to the international community, Libya's neighbors, the regional countries, to recognize that a stable and prosperous Libya is not only good for them, it's good for regional and international peace and security. And it's what the Libyans want. So everyone needs to get behind them and support them. And that Libya doesn't have to, there's no particular model that Libya needs to follow in the region. They can chart their own way forward, provided that model leads to a representative government. Because again, that's what Libyans in overwhelming numbers have called for.
Well, on that optimistic note, thank you very much, Stephanie Williams, again for joining us.
Thank you very much, Alistair.
That was Diplomatic Immunity. Thanks for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they listen. Follow us on Twitter at GU Diplomacy, and visit our website isd.georgetown.edu.